Hello there, I'm Lloyd Evans and you're watching the John Cedars channel from The Bunker, and in this video I want to talk about Watchtower Online Library. Now, Jehovah's Witnesses who are watching this will be familiar with Watchtower Online Library as being an online repository of Watchtower materials, Watchtower publications that they consider to have been provided for them by the faithful and discreet slave. Of course, before Watchtower Online Library, we had Watchtower Library. So you would rely on these discs. You would load the program onto your computer. Here we go. That's one of the most recent unopened CD-ROMs that I have in my collection. Here's incidentally one of the oldest CD-ROMs that I have in my collection. So anyway, you would load this program onto your computer and lo and behold, you would be able to search decades worth of publications. So with the Watchtower magazine, you could go back as far as 1950. With the Awake magazine, you could go back as far as 1970. And the same with most of the books and brochures, you could go back as far as 1970. So a number of decades were available to you there. Now, when they first set up Watchtower Online Library, initially you could only go as far back as the year 2000 with most things. But in fairly recent years, I'm talking in the last couple of years, in fact, they expanded it so that Watchtower Online Library is now effectively the same in terms of going back in time as the discs were. So if you go on Watchtower Online Library, you can go and read Watchtower magazines going as far back as 1950 and Awake magazines going as far back as 1970. It's interesting that there's a difference between the two there, which I will come to. But on this particular video, my patrons have asked me to explain the problem with Watchtower Online Library. So what publications are there that you will not find on Watchtower Library because they predate the 1970 cutoff, which is as far back as you can go if you want to read a book or booklet. Now, with the CD-ROMs, you could argue that these had a fairly limited amount of space on them, but clearly the same argument doesn't apply to how much material Watchtower can put on its website. So there isn't really any reason why you can't have at least English versions of all of these older books going more or less as far back as you want. You could go all the way back to Charles Taze Russell if you wanted. Why is it that you can't do that? Well, hopefully that will become obvious as this video unfolds, because I have chosen 10 publications that you will not find on Watchtower Online Library. And I'm going to start as recently as 1969, because if you'll remember, I said that for the Awakes, you can only go as far back as 1970. Why might that be? Here's one possible reason. I'm not saying it's just because of this article, by the way. I'm saying here's an example of the sort of article that you will find in Awake magazines older than 1970. It's this one from 1969. This is the May 22nd, 1969 Awake article, and it begins on page 14. Don't know whether you can see the graphic there. What future for the young? And this had some very interesting things to say. Bear in mind that in 1969, the organisation was on a countdown to Armageddon because it had been revealed in the 1966 book, Life Everlasting in Freedom of the Sons of God. Probably that's not on Watchtower Library either. So this is life everlasting in freedom of the sons of God. And it was this publication that kick-started the hysteria surrounding 1975. It pointed well and truly to that year as a year of significance in the outworking of God's purpose. So in that context, it's perhaps understandable that you would have this sort of awake article. Let me read part to you. If you are a young person, you also need to face the fact that you will never grow old in this present system of things. Why not? Because all the evidence in fulfillment of Bible prophecy indicates that this corrupt system is due to end in a few years. Of the generation that observed the beginning of the last days in 1914, Jesus foretold, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things occur." Therefore, as a young person, you will never fulfill any career that this system offers. If you are in high school and thinking about a college education, it means at least 4, perhaps even 6 or 8 more years to graduate into a specialised career. But where will this system of things be by that time? It will be well on the way towards its finish, if not actually gone. 1969, an Awake article is saying that a young person needs to face the fact, this is a fact apparently, or was a fact, that they would never grow old in this present system of things. Well, I was born 10 years after this. I'm 40. So therefore, someone who was born in 1969 would be 50. And here they are saying, you're not going to grow old. In fact, if you think about the length of time needed for a college education, for perhaps even 6 or 8 years to graduate into a specialised career, you're not going to have that. That's what they were telling children in 1969. I wonder why Watchtower wouldn't want witnesses to be able to read that. Now, again, I'm not suggesting that the 1970 cutoff for Awake magazines is because of this article in particular. I am just showing you like a whistle-stop tour of some of the crazy, crazy stuff. Not just crazy stuff, but stuff that Watchtower just doesn't want witnesses to see. That it hasn't included on Watchtower Online Library. There's more stuff, I'm sure, that I could point to if I had the time in Awake articles, both before and after 1969, that are dubious. But it's just that the further back in history you go, the crazier stuff you find in Watchtower literature. And that will become very obvious in this video. The next item I wanted to show you, which you will also not find on Watchtower Online Library, is a bit older, but it's also an Awake article. And it's this one. You'll excuse me if I don't get it out of its bound volume kind of cover. Probably you can see there it says, "Are you excommunicated?" So straight away you can see that we're talking here about excommunication, which I don't need to argue is the same as disfellowshipping. In fact, you can even find Watchtower references that equate disfellowshipping with excommunication. And yet here in 1947, they write this extraordinary article, "Are you also excommunicated?" which completely slams the Catholic Church for having this practice. And what's fascinating is that they go so strongly against excommunication, they go as far as to say it's unbiblical and it's pagan. Bear in mind, it wasn't until 1952 that the organisation started disfellowshipping people, and it wasn't until 1981 that it became impossible to actually leave gracefully, because they made it so that disassociation and disfellowshipping had the same penalty of shunning. So what does it say here about excommunication? The authority for excommunication, they claim, is based on the teachings of Christ and the apostles as found in the following scriptures. And then it cites a number of scriptures. But the hierarchy's excommunication as a punishment and medicinal remedy finds no support in these scriptures. In fact, it is altogether foreign to Bible teachings. Where then did this practice originate? The Encyclopaedia Britannica says that papal excommunication is not without pagan influence, and its variations cannot be adequately explained unless account be taken of several non-Christian analogues of excommunication. The superstitious Greeks believed that when an excommunicated person died, the devil entered the body, and therefore, in order to prevent it, the relatives of the deceased cut his body in pieces and boil them in wine. Even the Druids had a method of expelling those who lost faith in their religious superstitions. It was therefore after Catholicism adopted its pagan practices, AD 325, that this new chapter in religious excommunication was written. Thereafter, as the pretensions of the hierarchy increased, the weapon of excommunication became the instrument by which the clergy attained a combination of ecclesiastical power and secular tyranny that finds no parallel in history. It's an instrument of power, apparently, excommunication. It's also altogether foreign to Bible teachings, is what it says here. And it also has pagan origins that date back to the Druids. But hey, just a few years later, why don't we start doing it? Because it turns out that although it may not be in the Bible, at least it's an excellent way of controlling people. Now, the next publication I want to share with you is a book, and it's from the 1950s. You'll remember that I mentioned that you can't find books on Watchtower Online Library that are older than 1970. Well, here's a book from 1955. There it is. And the title is, You May Survive Armageddon into God's New World. This is an astonishing publication which spells out in extremely graphic detail basically the bloodlust that Watchtower leaders had. This was the mindset of, you could say, the original generation, if you subscribe to the crazy overlapping generations teaching. This was the expectation of the original generation of Watchtower leaders. And this informed the theology of the current leadership. Let me read to you from pages 341 to 342. I'll try to skip to the relevant parts, but you really do need to hear this. Blood will run deep as the royal avenger of blood on the white horse and his heavenly hosts ride their white horses of righteousness, theocratic warfare into the symbolic great winepress of the anger of God, where the vine of the earth, the visible earthly system, weighted down with wicked offspring, has been hurled. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, the New Jerusalem, and blood came out of the winepress as high up as the bridles of the horses, for a distance of 1,600 furlongs, or 200 miles, quoting from Revelation 14:18 to 20. Why should not blood run deep and far with over 2 billion dead? Was there ever a war of the length of Armageddon's duration that left even 1 billion dead? Have all the wars of mankind's existence killed directly a total of 2 billion warriors? Now, you may be wondering why it's talking about 2 billion. I checked this, and the world's population in 1955, when this was written, was around about 2.5 billion. So obviously now it's over 7.5 billion, but back then they really were lusting over the idea that billions were going to die at Armageddon. The global flood of Noah's day, which the Bible uses as a prophetic type of Armageddon, drowned all humans except the 8 in the ark, and the human population must then have numbered many millions. But Armageddon will be a tribulation such as has not occurred from the beginning of the creation which God created until that time, and will not occur again. With the members of this generation that will not pass away before Armageddon breaks out, numbering now 2,500,000,000, and with only the remnant and a larger group of other sheep inside the greater Noah's Ark surviving, the death toll of the war of the great day of God the Almighty will be appallingly all-surpassing, too many for the Armageddon survivors to bury. So yes, it says there, look, Earth's population at the moment, 2.5 billion. Let's see them all get slaughtered. They were looking forward to it. Come on, birds and beasts. Have your fill then from the human corpses in retribution for the wanton slaughter of animal and bird life, of which the human race has been guilty. Jehovah, the great avenger, will give you mistreated creatures your day. Apparently the birds and beasts have been mistreated. Humans, on the other hand, are worthy of slaughter if they don't become Jehovah's Witnesses. The extent of the slaughter may be measured by the number of the enemy taking part in the war and being annihilated. The wood of the weapons of Gog's hordes, the shields, targets, bows and arrows, hand staves and spears, will be so immense a pile that it will take 7 years to use it up as fuel, without collecting any wood from the forests. What wealth the exterminated ones will leave behind! The would-be despoilers of Jehovah's people will themselves be despoiled. Some time after the war has killed off all the visible earthly enemy, the land will be cleansed of flesh-stripped, sun-bleached bones by their being collected and put out of sight. I could go on, but I think you get the gist. It's not exactly bedtime reading for your young child, but yeah, what an appalling book. The Faithful and Discreet Slave of 1955, they're reveling in the slaughter of billions, to the point where they're thinking about their bones and they're thinking about their blood. Just astonishing. And this, again, witnesses could say, oh, that's old light. This was the mindset of the original generation that would not pass away. And this is the mindset of the leadership that trained the current leadership. So there's no excuses. This is part of the organization's history. This is what their thoughts were about Armageddon. They have exactly the same ideas today. If you listen to some of the talks that have been given by Tony Morris, where he talks about human hot dogs, and Gerrit Loesch talking about teams of people burying the bodies.
Till you smell human flesh burning from a helicopter crash, people that look like humans like a hot dog on a grill, blackened and splitting open. I know what's coming at Armageddon. A lot of dead people. A lot of dead people.
Billions of people will die, and they have to be buried. The Bible indicates in the prophecy that there will be groups of people, of brothers and sisters, that will for a long time do nothing else than just bury the dead.
The same ideology is in the minds of the current governing body. They're just not quite as brave about describing it as they were back in 1955. But I think it's perfectly understandable why witnesses are effectively barred from reading that, because again, it would be no stretch for Watchtower to make that text available on Watchtower Online Library. I think we can understand why they haven't done that yet. The next publication I want to show you is much older. It's actually one of the rarer items in my collection. It's an original copy of this book. See if I can get it close to the camera. Millions Now Living Will Never Die. I mean, the title alone. Bear in mind, Watchtower brags about this title if you read the Proclaimer's book and what have you, but it's not really a title they should be bragging about. This book was published in, was it 1920? Yeah, copyrighted 1920. So if everybody on the planet who was born after 1920 were to just suddenly vanish, who would be left? I mean, you'd be lucky to scrape together a few hundred people. Obviously, I realise there are people that old, but very, very few people are left. You'd struggle, certainly, to find millions of people on the planet who were born before 1920. And yet that was the prediction. Let's see what the actual theology of the time was. I'm going to read to you from page 89, under the heading Earthly Rulers. As we have heretofore stated, the Great Jubilee cycle is due to begin in 1925. At that time, the earthly phase of the kingdom shall be recognized. The Apostle Paul, in the 11th chapter of Hebrews, names a long list of faithful men who died before the crucifixion of the Lord and before the beginning of the selection of the church. These can never be a part of the heavenly class. They had no heavenly hopes, but God has in store something good for them. They are to be resurrected as perfect men and constitute the princes or rulers in the earth according to his promise. Therefore, we may confidently expect that 1925 will mark the return of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the faithful prophets of old, particularly those named by the apostle in Hebrews chapter 11, to the condition of human perfection. This is what you actually find when you read this book, rather than merely refer to its title. You find inside Watchtower, or Rutherford specifically, because he wrote this, Rutherford saying, we may confidently expect that 5 years from now, because he's writing this it's published in 1920, 5 years from now, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, hi Abraham, nice to have you back in human perfection, ready to be a prince and ruler in the earth. That's what the organization was teaching. And I'm going to show you another publication from this period later. But for those of you who again might be saying, oh, this was old light, it's not what the organization teaches, it's not representative of Jehovah's organization. This was published in 1920, the year after Jesus supposedly chose the leaders of the Watchtower Society to be his faithful and discreet slave. 1919, that's my faithful and discreet slave. They're going to provide spiritual food to the domestics. Those are the ones. They are the closest to the truth. A year later, this gets published. This utter nonsense gets published. And everyone gets told that Armageddon's coming in 1925. And Abraham and Isaac, Samson, Moses, all of these ones from Hebrews chapter 11 are going to magically emerge from nowhere and start leading a worldwide government. Absolutely incredible. And tied with this prediction is my next publication that, again, you will not find on Watchtower Online Library. It's this publication, The Way to Paradise. Now, this is very much a Watchtower publication. This wasn't written by Joseph Rutherford, but it was written by W.E. Van Amberg, who was secretary of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society. He was one of Charles Taze Russell's closest lieutenants, and when Russell died, it was W.E. Van Amberg and A.H. Macmillan who held the most proxy votes, and because they liked Rutherford, they were able to get Rutherford effectively elected as president, or they were mostly responsible for that happening. And in 1924, I mean, we've spoken about the Millions booklet and about how in 1920, a year after the selection, supposedly, of the faithful and discreet slave, Rutherford's saying, oh, well, you know, obviously, in 1925, Abraham's going to be back. And only a year before 1925 would come and they would know whether Rutherford's prediction would come true or not, W.E. Van Amberg writes this children's book, because it was intended for children, talking about how wonderful it's going to be the following year when all these Bible characters come back and set up this global government. I'm going to read now from pages 224 and 225. We should, therefore, expect shortly after 1925 to see the awakening of Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Melchizedek, Job, Moses, Samuel, David, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, John the Baptist, and others mentioned in the 11th chapter of Hebrews. These will form a nucleus of the new kingdom on earth. One of the first things necessary will be to put Jerusalem in condition to be the capital of the world. This will necessitate a great deal of work, but there will be many willing workers. Current news informs us that attention is already being centred upon Palestine, and thousands of Jews are trying to return there. Already considerable work has been done in the way of building better roads and cultivating the fields. However, we should not expect to see such systematic work underway until these princes have been awakened and placed in charge. The capital of every country should be in direct and quick communication with all parts of its territory. If Jerusalem is to be the capital of the world, it should be able to get into quick touch with every locality. Christ's kingdom is to undo in 1,000 years all the evil brought about in the previous 6,000 years. Old-fashioned methods will not suffice. Already we see great changes coming in. The wireless and radio can carry messages halfway around the world now, and by the time the princes are brought forth, these inventions will be perfected to reach all the way round. Abraham and Moses and King David are going to rule from their capital in Jerusalem, and they're going to be in contact with every part of the world over the radio. The princes can easily radio their instructions to any part of the world. Think of Prince Abraham having some general instructions to give, calling attention, and all the people everywhere listening and hearing every word he speaks as easily as though he were addressing them from the platform of a public hall. Of course, if anyone desires to visit Jerusalem and personally interview the princes, or if the princes should desire to make a personal inspection of some public work, aeroplanes will soon be so perfected that it will be a matter of but a few hours' ride to any part of the earth, to or from Jerusalem. This will indeed be a new world made glorious in every way. Look, I've not even necessarily picked the craziest part of this book, because it has all sorts of nonsense about resurrection and people growing to perfection and that kind of thing. It's really fanciful, really silly, and bear in mind that again, it's predicting something that is that at the time would have been only a few months away from knowing whether it would or wouldn't be fulfilled. W.E. Van Amberg is babbling about Abraham and Moses dispatching orders over the radio and flying around in aeroplanes from 1925, 1926. I think we can see why Watchtower doesn't really want witnesses to have easy access. I mean, sure, they're not telling people to burn these books yet, but you can see why it's not in the organisation's interests to have put material like that on Watchtower Online Library. For any reasonably minded person, this is unequivocal proof that the organisation was bonkers to begin with. So why should it be any better now? The next publication I want to show you comes in the form of a series of books that were written by Joseph Rutherford between the years 1931 and 1932. Bit close there. There we go. The Vindication series of books. And bear in mind what I was saying earlier about the faithful slave. Jehovah's Witnesses today believe that in 1919, Rutherford and his associates were chosen to be the faithful and discreet slave who would administer spiritual food to God's organisation. I've already spoken extensively on this channel about what sort of a person Rutherford was. If you haven't seen my videos chronicling some of the most disturbing features, you could say, of his character, please do check those out. But arguably the most ugly aspects of Rutherford, or among the most ugly parts of his character, were his anti-Semitism and his views of women. Both of those are on full display in these books. 1931 and 1932, again, is when they were written. And if you think about it, the timing is interesting, because the 1930s, of course, was when the far right was on the rise in Germany, and a certain Adolf Hitler was gaining power and influence. And I'm going to come to that in more detail, by the way, but you know, the 1930s were, of all the times to be an anti-Semite, someone against Jews, you could do a lot of damage if you were a person of influence writing vitriol against Jewish people, and that's what Rutherford made himself guilty of. And here are some examples. First of all, let me read to you from pages 257 and 258 of Volume 2 of Vindication. The Jews were evicted from Palestine, and their house left unto them desolate, because they rejected Christ Jesus, the beloved and anointed King of Jehovah. To this day, the Jews have not repented of this wrongful act committed by their forefathers. Many of them have been returned to the land of Palestine, but they have been induced to go there because of selfishness and for sentimental reasons. During the long period elapsing from the time of their expulsion to the present day, the Jews have not borne the shame of the heathen for Jehovah's sake, nor for the name of Christ. Now, this is actually very toxic language, because one of the biggest, you could say, one of the biggest engines of anti-Semitism, or the main fuel, so to speak, certainly in the build-up to World War II, was this idea among the Christian hard right that the Jews were to blame for the death of Jesus. And that's exactly what Rutherford's doing here. He's saying it's their fault that Jesus died, and they need to be sorry as a people for what their forefathers did. And he says that very clearly there. He's also characterizing Jewish people as selfish. So some quite clear anti-Semitism, but it gets worse. I'm reading to you now from the same book, pages 54 and 55. While most of these organizations and powers operate within the borders of the land called Christendom, yet many of them do not even pretend to be of organized Christianity. Among the powerful men who control the commerce of the sea are many Jews, so-called, yet who are against God and against Christ and against the kingdom of God. This is probably the reason why God by his prophet speaks of them separately and distinctly from Jerusalem, both ancient and modern. All are representatives of the devil, to be sure, and form a part of his organization. But the Lord is pointing them out as separate and integral parts of Satan's organization and gives his people a vision of them from different standpoints. Just astonishing hatred and bigotry here from the original faithful slave, if you believe that Rutherford and his colleagues in 1919 were chosen by Jesus to be the faithful slave. Here he is, this man, this early Watchtower leader, saying that Jews are representatives of the devil and perpetuating this stereotype that Jews are pulling the strings in big business, and therefore any economic calamity is to be blamed on them. Just really vile rhetoric. But as I mentioned, Rutherford's hatred was not confined merely to one group of people. He didn't just hate the Jews. He also had a very low opinion of women. I'm going to read to you now from volume 1 of Vindication. This is pages 159 and 160. This is actually more or less where we get the very first repudiation of Mother's Day. That, for those of you who don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate Mother's Day, and the exact reason is a bit ambiguous. But the true reason why Jehovah's Witnesses don't celebrate Mother's Day, and by extension Father's Day, is because Rutherford couldn't stand women, as is very clear from what I'm about to read. So page 159, on the face of it, the arrangement of Mother's Day seems harmless and calculated to do good. But the people are in ignorance of Satan's subtle hand in the matter, and that he is back of the movement to turn the people away from God. The slogan is, the best mother who ever lived, the purpose being to establish creature worship, or at least to divert the attention of man from the proper worship of God. There have been many good mothers of men, and many bad ones. Not every man has the best mother that ever lived, and therefore the slogan is false. The woman that dishonours Jehovah God and blasphemes his name is not a good woman, regardless of how many children she may bear, whereas some of her children may be faithful servants of God. The good mother is the one who serves and honors Jehovah and teaches her children to do likewise, and who renders her proper motherly duties in the home. Real men have great respect and great love for such mothers, but their worship is given to Jehovah God. Neither the man nor the woman should be worshipped for doing right, because such doing of right is their duty. Creature worship of any kind is wrong and an abomination in the sight of God. This is actually something that pops up in Rutherford's teachings repeatedly. He often mentions creature worship, by which he means worship of humans. It seems, though, that when it came to people worshipping or venerating him, well, that wasn't so bad. It was basically any humans other than him, or any creatures other than him, that weren't to be worshipped. I'll continue. In Christendom, men have formed the habit of quoting their mothers as authority for their course of action, and of utterly ignoring God's word. In Christendom, the women teach and preach and prophesy in the churches, and predict and prophesy in the affairs of state concerning peace and war. The women are seducing and misleading men, cause them to mix politics and religion, and often compromise their duty toward God in order to comply with the rules of this unrighteous world. Such is fornication in the scriptural meaning of that term. Notwithstanding, I have a few things against thee, because thou sufferest that woman Jezebel, which calleth herself a prophetess, to teach and to seduce my servants to commit fornication, and to eat things sacrificed unto idols. Revelation 2 verse 20. Such is contrary to God's rule, but I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over the man, but to be in silence. 1 Timothy 2 verse 12. So astonishingly sexist ideology on display there from Rutherford. He didn't like women who had influence in politics or religion, particularly if that influence was influence over men. He thought that mothers should be rendering their proper motherly duties in the home. He thought that a good Christian mother was basically a Jehovah's Witness. If you're not a Jehovah's Witness, then you can't be a good mother, and by extension a good woman. And you should be thinking about, if you're having children, then you should be making sure you're indoctrinating them. Then you can be a good woman, then you can be a good mother. But you're not entitled to an opinion. You're not entitled to influence. You're not even entitled to being celebrated on Mother's Day, because that would be creature worship. And Rutherford, again, only wanted people to venerate him and celebrate him. So just astonishing. And again, clear as day why Jehovah's Witnesses don't get to read these books on Watchtower Online Library, because they may get closer to realizing the origins of this organization. Now, so far I've been reading to you directly from my own original copies of all of these older Watchtower publications, and you can see I have quite an extensive collection to draw from, thanks to the many over the years who have sent me older publications. And I'm very pleased with my collection for the precise reason that I'm making this video, because it's the older publications that are most valuable in showing the true nature and the true origins of the organization. There is, however, one item on the list of things that I wanted to show you that I don't have an original copy of. Maybe that will change one day, but for now I don't have it. It's the Golden Age, July 24th, 1929. So the Golden Age was the very first name given to what is now the Awake. It started off as the Golden Age. It became the Consolation. and nowadays it's known as the Awake magazine. So the July 24th, 1929 Golden Age magazine had a sort of questions from readers section in it. And one of the questions was, is there anything in the Bible that reveals the origin of the Negro? Answer: it is generally believed that the curse which Noah pronounced upon Canaan was the origin of the black race. Certain it is that when Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren," he pictured the future of the coloured race. They have been and are a race of servants. But now, in the dawn of the 20th century, we are all coming to see this matter of service in its true light, and to find that the only real joy in life is in serving others, not bossing them. There is no servant in the world as good as a good coloured servant. And the joy that he gets from rendering faithful service is one of the purest joys there is in the world. I actually think that's probably the most disgusting thing that Watchtower has ever put in print. I'd struggle to find something. It's so disgusting that as I'm reading it, I'm thinking, let's hope this video doesn't get taken down by YouTube, because it's so vile and bigoted and racist that reading it now, 90 years after it was first published, it's a universe away from where we are in terms of civil rights. But bear in mind, 1929 may be 90 years ago from 2019, but it was only 10 years in the future from 1919, which is again when the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society was chosen, apparently, to be God's faithful and discreet slave. And here, 10 years on from being chosen out of all of the religions of the world, we need to choose the one that's closest to scriptural truth. Well, this is apparently the closest that they could get, or that God could get. This grotesque organisation that had this view of black people, calling them a race of servants. Just absolutely astonishing. I don't even want to dwell on it too much. But is it any surprise, again, is it any surprise that you're not going to find that pop up on Watchtower Online Library? They're never going to have that. They are never going to have that on Watchtower Online Library. Because immediately, when you read it and you spend any time thinking about it, unless you are yourself a racist, it completely torpedoes any possibility of this being Jehovah's organisation. When you really think about it, and you think about it in context of when it was written, again, 10 years after 1919, how could this possibly be Jehovah's organisation when they're coming out with that? Just think, if you'd have been alive back then, if you're watching this as a Jehovah's Witness, if you'd have been alive back then, it would have been your responsibility and duty to distribute a magazine, a Golden Age magazine with those words in it. Incredible, isn't it? I don't want to dwell on it too long. I think I've said everything that needs to be said. We need to move on to, because probably you've noticed, I'm going somewhere with my numbering. We're going into some really dark places now that we're getting down to the end of the list. And we're now at number 3. And this is a book that I've mentioned a few times on my channel already. But it simply we cannot afford to forget that this was once published by Watchtower. It's the 1934 yearbook of Jehovah's Witnesses. There's no way There's just no way. And what's fascinating, the reason why this is such an interesting book is because Watchtower was so proud of its stance on Nazi Germany back in 1934 when this was published. They were so proud of their stance that they put the Declaration of Facts, they actually published it as part of the yearbook. Now, if you're a Jehovah's Witness, you've probably heard of the Declaration of Facts, but you only ever hear them talk about it. You never see them actually show you the Declaration of Facts so that you can decide for yourself what kind of document it is. Because it turns out when you actually read the Declaration of Facts, which you can do because Watchtower was stupid enough to immortalize it in the 1934 yearbook, when you actually read it, you think, oh, this was a very different organization in the 1930s, in the early 1930s, than the one I was led to believe. Because Jehovah's Witnesses are repeatedly told that they made a firm stand against Nazi Germany and Adolf Hitler. What they're not told is that they only did that, they only turned against Hitler and Nazi Germany when their attempts at ingratiating themselves to the Nazis had failed abysmally. That's what the Declaration of Facts was about. The Declaration of Facts was a document it was Watchtower's attempt at cozying up with the Nazis by saying, we have so much in common, we really admire your stance on Jewish people, we really admire the principles of your government, in fact there are principles as well, so why don't we all be on the same side? That's essentially what the Declaration of Facts says. I'm not going to read too much from this book because I want to kind of encourage you to look up a PDF yourself and do the digging, especially if you happen to be a Jehovah's Witness. But let me read a couple of quotes. Again, it churns my stomach to read this, but we need to know what this organization was saying. Page 136. Instead of being against the principles advocated by the government of Germany, we stand squarely for such principles and point out that Jehovah God, through Christ Jesus, will bring about the full realization of these principles and will give to the people peace and prosperity and the greatest desire of every honest heart. The principles of the government of Germany in 1934 were apparently the same as the principles, not just of Watchtower, but of Jehovah and Jesus, apparently. Page 134. It is falsely charged by our enemies that we have received financial support for our work from the Jews. Nothing is farther from the truth. Up to this hour, there never has been the slightest bit of money contributed to our work by Jews. We are the faithful followers of Christ Jesus and believe upon him as the Saviour of the world, whereas the Jews entirely reject Jesus Christ and emphatically deny that he is the Saviour of the world, sent of God for man's good. This of itself should be sufficient proof to show that we receive no support from Jews, and that therefore the charges against us are maliciously false and could proceed only from Satan, our great enemy. The greatest and the most oppressive empire on earth is the Anglo-American Empire. By that is meant the British Empire, of which the United States of America forms a part. It has been the commercial Jews of the British American Empire that have built up and carried on big business as a means of exploiting and oppressing the peoples of many nations. This fact particularly applies to the cities of London and New York, the stronghold of big business. This fact is so manifest in America that there is a proverb concerning the city of New York which says, the Jews own it, the Irish Catholics rule it, and the Americans pay the bills. What a way to throw Jewish people under the bus at a time in history when that sort of rhetoric and that sort of ideology and that sort of hatred actually had a body count attached to it. And how wrong could Watchtower be in saying in 1934 that the biggest threat, the most oppressive empire, was Britain and America? How wrong can you possibly be? And yet this is an organisation, an anti-Semitic, Jew-hating organisation that claims to have it right on everything else. You have to ask, as a Jehovah's Witness, how could this possibly have come from an enlightened leadership that had God's backing? Now I'm nearing the end of my list of publications that you simply will not find on Watchtower Online Library. My penultimate publication that I dabbled with whether this should be number 1 on the list, but it made it to number 2. And it's The Finished Mystery. There we have it. That's my 1917 edition of The Finished Mystery. Now, this is significant for 2 reasons. Firstly, again, if you buy into this idea that Jesus came and inspected the world's religions invisibly between 1914 and 1919, and chose the Bible students under the leadership of Rutherford to be his faithful slave, you also have to accept that Jesus approved of the contents of this publication because it was published in 1917, slap bang in the middle of this period, and it was being widely distributed by followers of Rutherford in 1919, when again this selection allegedly took place. So you could argue that this book is a crucial barometer of what it was that Jesus would have found appealing about the organisation. It was the principal publication that Watchtower was pushing when this fateful selection took place. And yet we know so little about it, or Jehovah's Witnesses know so little about it, because again, you can't just go on Watchtower Online Library and read it for yourself. The other reason why it's significant, because again, I can imagine so many witnesses watching this saying, oh, you're talking about old light, it's no longer relevant, it's not what we believe, blah, blah, blah. If you read the Revelation Climax book, which probably you also think is old light, but basically look up the words finished mystery on Watchtower Online Library, and even though you can't access the book itself, there are repeated mentions of this book as being part of the outworking of Bible prophecy. So even though they don't let witnesses read the book itself, they're very proud of this book and repeatedly refer to it as being an integral part of, again, the fulfillment of Bible prophecy. Well, goodness me, what's inside it that could be so significant and so groundbreaking? Now listen, this is a very thick book, and apart from anything else, it's very old. It's not in great condition, if I'm being completely honest. So I'm not going to start leafing through it for you. It's the last page has the number 592, so 600 pages. I'm going to just tell you, it's nonsense. It's utter nonsense from beginning to end. And rather than reading to you passages from it, probably the easiest way of doing this is if I read to you my summation or my review of this book as I wrote it in my own book, The Reluctant Apostate. So I'm now going to read to you, and by all means, check what I've said against the book itself. You can get hold of PDFs online. I'm going to refer to that at the end of the video. So I'm now going to read to you from pages 274 to 276 of The Reluctant Apostate. By all means, check everything I've said and decide for yourselves whether I'm being fair about the finished mystery. There is no polite way of putting it. The book is a slow-motion train wreck from start to finish, and its publication would go on to generate considerable unnecessary misery for the very individuals who championed its creation. Firstly, there was the book's unbounded glorification of the pastor, who was all but deified in its pages. The amount of work that Pastor Russell performed is incredible, and it is doubtful whether it was ever equalled by any other human being, the writer insisted. The same page also marvels that the pastor managed his unparalleled work despite poor health, including such distressing hemorrhoids that it was impossible for him to rest in the easiest chair. Not only did the finished mystery confirm Russell as the faithful and wise servant, it also declared him to be the seventh angel mentioned in Revelation. Though dead, Russell was described as supervising the harvest work, and Ezekiel 33 verse 22 was invoked to claim he was speaking from beyond the grave through the pages of the finished mystery. The loud voice of Revelation 14 verse 18 was reimagined as a disappointed cry from Russell because he did not have time to complete the finished mystery himself. Even Russell's marital problems were hailed as a fulfillment of Bible prophecy. It was explained that the book of Ezekiel had foretold that God would separate Russell from his wife and make her dead in his eyes. But the pastor was not the only subject of the book's fantastic claims. The behemoth of Job chapter 40 was explained as being the stationary steam engine, and the Leviathan of Job chapter 41 was revealed to be the steam locomotive. Page 93 disclosed that the valiant men of Nahum 2 verse 3 were the locomotive engineer and fireman. The authors were apparently keen train enthusiasts. The rider on the white horse in Revelation 6 verse 2 was unmasked as the Bishop of Rome, referred to as the personal representative of Satan. The earth was revealed to be 48,000 years old. The finished mystery was described as divinely provided to humanity and identified as the incense burner of Revelation 8 verse 5. Michael and his angels from Revelation chapter 12 were determined as being the Pope and his bishops. England was condemned as having a satanic character. Revelation 14 verse 20, it was claimed, predicted the precise travelling distance between where the finished mystery was written and where it was printed. Barbed wire, cash registers, typewriters and vacuum cleaners were among a list of inventions and discoveries resulting from increased enlightenment for the world since 1874 due to the glory of Christ, as foretold in Revelation 18 verse 1. The voice out of heaven of Revelation 18 verse 4 was explained as being the voice of the Watchtower Society. Europeans were denounced as the most cruel, bloodthirsty, quarrelsome, rapacious people on earth. And 1918 was pointed to as the year in which God destroys the churches wholesale and the church members by the millions, while spirit-anointed Christians are raised to heaven, with 1931 later heralding the final establishment of Christ's kingdom on earth. In short, the book reads like one long acid trip by someone who has spent an unhealthy amount of time immersed in the strange fantasies and endless predictions of Charles Taze Russell. So again, maybe you think I'm being unkind there, or maybe you think I'm even making this up. Go and look up the book yourself. You can do so. You can go on a website I'm going to give you at the end of this video. You can find a PDF. Give yourself some time, maybe pour yourself a glass of wine and just be prepared for some utter madness that came from, quote unquote, Jehovah's organization in the period when it was being inspected by Jesus so that Rutherford could be chosen as the faithful slave. I'm not exaggerating. All of that stuff and more is in there. I've just given you, again, some of the craziest parts. But is it any wonder that you're not going to find Finished Mystery? Oh, selecting it on Watchtower Online, like, oh, Finished Mystery. Oh, I think I might give this a read. Oh, what's the worst that could happen? Now we're finally at the last item on my list of 10 publications you will not find on Watchtower Online Library. And you will notice that we have been on a whistle-stop tour through the organisation's history, going as far back as 1917. The last item on the list, though, is not a historic publication. It's actually a brand new publication, but witnesses still aren't able to read it on Watchtower Online Library, and it's this publication. Shepherd the Flock of God. This is the Secret Elders Manual that you're not allowed to read if you are an ordinary Jehovah's Witness. Watchtower will argue that the reason you're not allowed to read it is because the information is relevant only to elders. If they were to argue that, then they would be lying, because it's very quickly apparent when you're reading the pages that there are rules and policies in this book that ordinary witnesses have a right to know about. Now, at the very end of this video, I'm not going to go through an exhaustive summation of what you will find in this book, because I've recently, of course, done a whole series on it, a series of live streams with the help of some of my friends. There's also a highlights video, which itself is about 3 hours long because it's a thick book. There was a lot to get through, and obviously we needed to comment on some of the worst parts of it. So if you haven't already checked out those videos and you're interested in knowing what's in this book, check out those videos. But let me just give you a couple of examples of why witnesses have a right to see what is in this publication. The first thing I want to show you is what I'm calling don't ask, don't tell policies. So if you can keep something to yourself and not tell anyone, you can get away with it, essentially. And this is most disturbing in the list of rules pertaining to the appointment and deletion of elders. So there's a whole chapter, chapter 8, talking about the various things that you could be deleted as an elder for doing. And then in point 25, there's the heading, committed a disfellowshipping offence years in the past, and the matter was never addressed. The body of elders may determine he, that's the elder, can continue to serve if the following is true: the immorality or other serious wrongdoing occurred more than a few years ago, and he is genuinely repentant, recognizing that he should have come forward immediately when he sinned. Perhaps he has even confessed to his sin, seeking help with his guilty conscience. He has been serving faithfully for many years, has evidence of God's blessing, and has the respect of the congregation. Bear in mind that an elder is here, according to this rule, being let off the hook for a disfellowshipping offence that he has kept quiet about, even though this same elder could conceivably find himself on a judicial committee judging guilt for someone who has come forward about doing the same thing potentially. So they've come forward about something. Maybe it's on their conscience. Maybe they've been discovered by someone else. And their sin is being discussed by this group of 3 elders. Conceivably, one of those elders could have been historically guilty of doing the same thing, but never been disfellowshipped for it. That is utter hypocrisy. The second and final thing I want to show you in the Shepherd Book, and again, I would encourage you, if you haven't done so, to do a more exhaustive investigation into this book. But for me, if I have to think what's the most disgusting thing in the Shepherd Book that, again, witnesses are unaware of because they don't have access or they're not given access to this publication by the organisation, it's a very simple matter of comparing what's on 2 different pages. So if you go to chapter 14, it's all about child abuse, and there's a section, legal considerations. So what are the legal considerations regarding child sexual abuse? Child abuse is a crime. In some jurisdictions, individuals who learn of an allegation of child abuse may be obligated by law to report the allegation to the secular authorities. To ensure that elders comply with child abuse reporting laws, 2 elders should immediately call the legal department for legal advice when the elders learn of an accusation of child abuse. So elders come to learn of child abuse, and their priority is to ring the legal department for advice to find out whether they are forced by law to report. So that's Watchtower's advice when children are being abused, call the legal department. Compare that with chapter 21.31 in a whole different chapter about kingdom halls. How do we look after our kingdom halls? What should we do? When property damage occurs, quick action can go far in preventing further damage. Break-ins, thefts, arson, or other incidents of vandalism should be promptly reported to the local authorities. There's no other word for it. That is disgusting. When you are putting property and stuff, when you are placing that as more urgent for protection, more urgent for notifying the authorities than children who are being abused, you have no right to be calling yourself God's organisation. You have no right to be claiming any kind of moral authority when your priorities are so badly messed up. So no wonder, again, that the Shepherd Book isn't available on Watchtower Online Library. It should be. The information is relevant, as far as I'm concerned, to Jehovah's Witnesses. They have a right to know how elders adjudicate over cases of wrongdoing, etc., but they are kept entirely in the dark. If you are watching this video as a Jehovah's Witness and you're thinking, well, I agree, this stuff's relevant, but how on earth do I find it? Good news, there is a website where you can find it. It's called avoidjw.org. Now, interestingly, Watchtower legally threatened the founder of avoidjw.org, sent them a cease and desist letter threatening legal action against them for quote-unquote breach of copyright, because Watchtower doesn't want anyone to disseminate what they have printed. I mean, when you think about it, it's absurd, because the whole idea is that spiritual food needs to be spread far and wide. It's from God. It needs to have the biggest possible distribution. Avoidjw.org most of the stuff that you find on there is literally just stuff that Watchtower has printed, most of which again is inaccessible to the average Jehovah's Witness. And Watchtower has responded by legally threatening the founder of the website. Now, good news, they weren't successful in threatening or intimidating the person who set up the website. And in fact, the files on avoidjw.org are mostly hosted, I think all of them, in fact, are hosted on by a different organization, Faith Leaks. So usually when you click on a link, it will take you to Faith Leaks. Faith Leaks is administered by the Truth and Transparency Project, and they have a very capable legal team, which is more than a match for any legal threats that Watchtower can throw around. So there's no immediate likelihood of this material getting taken down. So you're able to research all of these publications and more on avoidjw.org. I will put links anyway to the specific publications I've been talking about in the description below, so that if there's a certain publication you want to look at more, you can easily do so. Of course, if you're not frightened to spend a bit of money, then a lot of these publications you can also find on eBay, depending on how old they are. But yeah, hopefully I don't need to repeat myself. It's blatantly obvious why this stuff isn't on Watchtower Online Library. It's because if most witnesses were to read it, they would very quickly come to the realization that no way can this be God's one and only true organization. It's a man-made organization that has got it wrong on pretty much every issue that matters, going right back through history. And they are entirely unworthy of people's respect and admiration and loyalty. I just want to give a quick shout out to my patrons. It was my patrons who chose this video. Every month we have a vote as to which video subject I should address, and this is one that was chosen. So thank you to my patrons who chose this video. I've enjoyed talking about it. Hopefully the information has been useful to those of you who are watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the John Cedars channel for more such videos. And as always, thank you for watching.